Really.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IPython developer meeting for Thursday, June 19th. And it's good to see everyone. Fernando won't be joining us today. He's at a conference. But we have Zach Saylor back after he's been at his first year of graduate school. And then our usual familiar faces as well. So let's dig into the agenda.
Okay, kernel specs.
So I was the kernel specs command line API and the REST API for querying kernel specs has landed. The next part I'm working on is the changes to the kernels and sessions REST APIs that will be necessary for the concept of kernels with different kinds of kernels. So you can, instead of just saying start a kernel, you can say start a kernel for Python, start an R kernel, a Julia kernel, or whatever. So the changes to the kernels REST API, I think, were fairly straightforward. Now I'm working on the sessions API, and we have a bit of a question about, at the moment, the handlers for the sessions talk to a session manager, but at the moment the session manager is just really a record of the connections between notebooks and kernels. It doesn't have a handle on the notebook manager or the kernel manager. So the way that it works is the handler itself actually queries the notebook manager for what path the kernel should be started in. Then it talks to the kernel manager to start a kernel, and then it records that information in the session manager.
Correct. So just to catch everyone up, so the work you've done so far is in the Python APIs for the kernel manager?
Yeah.
And so does that allow you now to query which kernels are available and then to start those kernels?
At the Python level, but not yet at the REST level. That's what we're asking about.
Yeah. Okay. So and at the Python level, where are those hooks? Or where are those methods? Are they on the kernel manager?
So kernel manager, because the kernel manager class manages one kernel, so that has a new kernel name traitlet, which determines which kernel it will start up, and then.
Okay, so you're talking. So sorry, there are multiple. At different points, we've had three different entities that we call the kernel manager. So you're talking about.
Well, there is a class actually called Kernel Manager, and then we have Multi-Kernel Manager, which builds on top of that.
Yes. Okay. So you're talking about the lowest. So far, you've done the work on the lowest level one that manages a single kernel, and it basically is the process management class for that. And the so that single kernel class, does it have any way of querying which kernels are available?
Yes. Yes, there is a new kernel spec manager, which exists to query what kernels are available and install kernels.
Okay, and does the kernel manager have one of those, or do you use one of those in conjunction, sort of separately?
The kernel manager has one of those.
Okay, gotcha. So then, and when you query which kernels are available, do you get back a list, or do you get back a list of kernel names, or do you get back a list of JSON structures, or?
API level, you get back a list of JSON structures.
Okay.
That's already landed. We merged that bit yesterday.
Okay. And so the question then is, how do we expose this in a RESTful API? Is that...
So the querying is already exposed in a RESTful API.
Yeah, that's what's done. It's what's remaining to do is for a given kernel, how do you ask to start a kernel with a given spec? And when you get a kernel from REST, what information does it have about itself, about its spec? Because right now it only has its ID. I guess there's two questions. One is in REST, when you ask, give me this kernel, or give me the kernel for this notebook.
Right.
Tell how much information should be in that.
Yeah. So I mean, the model that Zach and I sort of came up that, I mean, we're really, again, just copying how GitHub does this, is that for each resource we exposed in the RESTful API that we define formally the quote model for that.
Yeah.
And it, in general, GitHub and our other models are fairly verbose in the sense that, unless there's a really good reason to exclude information, it probably makes sense to return it. And so I guess my thought is,
okay.
Well, I guess my thought is the kernel model that we would return would have the full set of information. And previously, the only thing in the kernel model was the kernel ID. I think, at least. And so I think this would just have the rest of the fields that are in the JSON structure.
So all I'm actually adding to it at the moment is the kernel name, because in terms of starting and managing the kernels, that's all you need is that identifier for what type of kernel this is.
Right. What about how will the front end access the other resources that the kernel has available?
So, do you mean things like the icons?
Yeah, icons, custom JavaScript.
So that's part of the REST API that was already merged, is ways to access those resources.
Okay. So the current REST API provides a model not for kernels but for kernel specs.
Yes.
Okay. So we are distinguishing between kernels and kernel specs, and I'm assuming there's a separate top-level kernel spec REST endpoint.
Yeah.
Okay. No. Okay. That I'm sorry. I'm catching up.
So the question is, when you get a kernel, should it basically just have the key that you use to look up in the
Kernel
spec, or or does it have everything, or is it somewhere in between?
Well, so the model that GitHub uses and that we've been following is a little surprising in that when there is a containment relationship between different models in the REST API, so for example in GitHub there's users and repositories and organizations and users, the general idea is that when you query a top-level entity, it actually includes the full model for the child entities.
Well, it's actually not. They're not actually consistent on that.
What?
Because it depends on the nature of sometimes it will just have a link.
It does. No.
I mean, if you query the IPython repository, it doesn't automatically give you the full contents of every issue on the IPython repository.
Right, but it does give you a link to the issues for this, so you don't actually have to compute the second URL. It says this is the URL to hit to get.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, it's showing a catalog. That's what OpenStack does too.
I think Twitter also but Twitter includes all the data of the child tweets in their REST API.
Yeah.
Is there an added cost to making a second REST API call?
Well, but I think there's a question, and that is, conceptually, what is the relationship between kernel models and kernel spec models? It seems like there's one of containment, that a kernel contains a kernel spec. Is that?
Well, I would say that it's more a kernel is an instance of a kernel spec. Kernel spec is kind of a class. It's not actually a class object, but
Well, but in a
semantically, that is, kernel specs are types and kernels are instances. But there's also a bit of complexity because in the kernel spec information we kind of include two kinds of information. There's the information about how to start the kernel, which the front end never actually needs to know about because it can just say, start me a kernel of type X, and the back end deals with looking up how to start that type of kernel.
right.
And there is information about the language that kernel can interpret in terms of, like, how to do syntax highlighting and things, which is obviously you need for the front end, but that's not really part of the kernel API.
Right.
So
I think
I'm fairly happy with the solution we already have on this, which is that kernels just have a name property which identifies which kernel spec they belong to.
would having, I mean, I think in cases where the containment involves a lot of data, I think that's sort of one heuristic that GitHub uses to determine whether the parent model includes the full child model is if the children models are a lot of data, they'll just include references to them rather than the full data. In this case, it's not a one-to-many relationship, it's just a one-to-one relationship. One kernel has one kernel spec, and the amount of information is fairly small, right? I mean, it's
many-to-one relationship, in fact. Many kernels have one kernel spec. The amount of information is pretty small, but...
And would the kernels having the kernel spec full data ever save us additional AJAX calls?
In the notebook UI, no, because we will use...
So the information about the syntax highlighting and things has to be stored in the notebook metadata itself, because there's no guarantee that you have the relevant kernel spec installed on the computer where you open the notebook. So no, it's never saving us an AJAX call, at least within our model.
As long as I think it just storing the name of the kernel spec is fine then.
Yeah. Do you want to try to do the link style, or just do the name for now?
And the link style would have a...
So one of the nice things that has kind of evolved in the GitHub API is that rather than... So they used to have a lot of things like the pull request number is this, the repo name is this, and then if you wanted to fetch related information,
you had to
compute the new URL, which meant that it was sensitive to API changes and all that. And one of the things they've significantly, or slowly, but by now significantly, increased is that if there's related information, instead of, or in addition to the key that you would use, that you could use to construct another request, is just the actual link itself.
Yes. No, I'm as long as we can provide those links in a way that will work through proxies. I think that's a fantastic pattern.
Since that's a general thing, maybe we can get to that. That could be a standalone project that's on that.
Yeah.
Rather than doing that here.
In this case, it will nicely facilitate making the AJAX requests that we're never going to make. So.
No,
Getting back to the question I was trying to ask, the sessions REST API, at the moment, the logic, so when you create a session that starts a kernel and the session is the association between the notebook and the kernel.
Correct.
At the moment, the logic for starting a kernel is actually in the HTTP handler for the sessions API, and the sessions manager object doesn't know anything about either the multi-kernel manager or the notebook manager. So, is there a particular reason it's designed like that, or does it make sense to move that logic into the session manager and have the HTTP handlers be more of just a thin wrapper around it?
Yeah, I can talk about the why we ended up like that. I think the cleanest, most decoupled way of implementing this is to not have the session manager actually start kernels or save notebooks, for example. And basically, so when the front end wants to start a kernel for a notebook, it has to make separate calls to start the kernel and then create a session for that. That the web service for the session manager knows, it truly doesn't even have a handle on the notebook manager or the kernel manager. Now, the problem with that is that the number of AJAX calls the front end needs to make to do different operations gets really annoying. The error handling gets difficult. And so we basically pushed those composite operations down to the session manager handlers so that like starting a kernel for a session was an atomic operation that would either fail or succeed. And I think there's other operations as well that the session manager handles.
Well, the session manager itself handles.
Yeah, the session manager doesn't do anything.
The session manager
remembers,
is just a record.
Well, I mean the handlers, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, having all this logic in the HTTP handlers seems kind of a bit weird.
Yeah, I mean the other part of this is that I think we've tried as much as possible to make it so that if we ever wanted to, or someone wanted to build a version of the notebook server that was designed to scale or be run in a different way, that you could imagine having the session API running on this backend host, the kernel manager on this backend host. And so originally I actually wanted to make it so that the different RESTful endpoints knew nothing about each other. Now, over time, that's the first place that crept in was in the notebook list. Notebook listing makes a call to the kernel manager to see which kernels are running for the different notebooks. That was the first sort of leaky abstraction that we had. And then the calls that well, and I'm sorry, again, I'm confusing language. I think it's the handlers that for the notebook manager or for the notebook web service that call the kernel manager. And then the session handlers was the next point where we sort of broke that abstraction. I still think it's good design if there's any way we can keep the actual manager object separately.
So
Like
maybe we'll start with, to recap some of the stuff that we talked about yesterday that prompted the idea that, because where we ended up yesterday was it seemed like it made more sense for the session manager to have a handle on the kernel manager and the notebook manager. Is like, I guess there's a couple pieces of this. One is from an API standpoint. There are basically two ways that you might start and stop and work with kernels.
Yes.
There's associated with the notebook, in which case you use just a kernel, in which case you use the kernel's API. Or if you want to, or you use a kernel for a notebook, in which case you use just the sessions API and you don't use the kernel's API.
Right. Well, although there are some calls where
you start and stop kernels with the sessions API.
Gotcha.
In the middle, interrupt and everything is the kernel's API. But you ask for a kernel with the sessions API and you destroy them with the sessions API.
Yep.
And so, in thinking about it that way, it makes sense for the session model to basically, since it's used for the same thing as the kernel model, the session model should be the kernel model plus the reference to whatever notebook-related information, right? Because that's what a session is a kernel plus a notebook.
Well, so actually one. Are you thinking that there would be is a relationship between a session and a kernel? Right
now, a session model is a notebook name and path. Plus a kernel model.
Yeah.
And so when we're adding things to the kernel model, kernel spec related stuff such as the name, do we need to duplicate? If the way it's written now, we either need to get in if we don't change how the manager associations, then in order to maintain that, we either need to add a bunch of duplicate information to the session manager that's just a copy.
And therefore can potentially get out of sync, etc.
Yeah, which will get out of sync because we break things all the time. And the other is to, in the handler, get part of the session model from the session manager, but the session manager doesn't actually have an entire session model, and then get the kernel model from the kernel manager in the handler.
So what we wanted to do was push knowledge of the kernel manager into the session manager so that when you request the session model, it looks up the kernel ID and adds in other information as necessary.
Yeah, so only
kernel name.
Only store the information in the kernel manager, and then the session manager looks it up by kernel ID, so that the session manager returns a complete model.
And so basically moving that logic from the session handler down to the session manager.
Yeah, and so and the idea that I have in my mind, which is kind of in opposition to your idea of the scalable deployment stuff, is thinking of the handlers and the objects kind of like magics. Right, in the way Fernando talks about magics, is the magics should do almost nothing but turn a command line thing into a regular library API call. And so my view of the handlers is they should do as little as possible to turn a HTTP request into an API call.
Absolutely. No.
Right now there's quite a bit of logic in the session handlers. So if you wanted to create sessions,
absolutely,
by another mechanism, such as writing your own handler. Like if you were doing some other type deployment, you would probably have to rewrite a lot of these handlers. And if there's more logic in the model, or sorry, more logic in the manager than
Yes.
the handler, then actually using new handlers would be simpler.
No, and I mean, absolutely, in the sense that when we put that logic into the session handler, we were breaking this abstraction that I was promoting. And I think you're right that what you're proposing is a better way to express this. And you really, I mean, and I guess another way of saying it is that if we wanted to build something that scales better, it's advantageous to have well-defined Python APIs that themselves can be scaled out, let the handlers remain super simple, and then figure out separately how to scale out the session manager. But I mean, I don't think we're doing that right now.
Yeah.
But I think this makes total sense.
Okay, so session manager has a on the managers and returns a full model.
Great. Yeah.
Sounds good. Those are the two things that I remember from yesterday. Was there anything else?
Just briefly, we're starting to think about the ideas of like delayed kernel start.
Right.
Just to check that we're on the same page. Min's idea of how this works with the APIs is that the session is strictly the association between a notebook and a kernel. So if you don't have a kernel started, then you don't have a session started.
Correct. That's
Okay.
the idea. I mean, the only other, you had said one other thing about sessions that a bit of future thinking. At some point, I spent a little time thinking about whether or not we would also want the ability to reuse sessions for multi-user real-time collaboration purposes. That a session has a kernel, a notebook, and a set of users, for example. We're not there yet, but that was another bit of information that at one point we sort of thought, well, gosh, maybe these session objects would be a more generically useful thing for that purpose.
Yeah, but at this point, the notebook model will be on the server side, right? So probably the notion of session will not be used by the JavaScript anymore.
Yeah, no, and I think.
Yes. Enough will have to change that I don't think we can reason about that.
Absolutely.
While making decisions today.
Yeah, no, I only bring that up to say that the session might need to mutate over time to include other information, but it would involve a lot of changes that we're not doing now. But back to the other issue you just brought up, which was, delayed kernel starting. I guess the way I had envisioned it is that when you open a notebook, that the thing that would trigger kernel starting is the user. Well, I mean, a couple models. One, you could say we trigger kernel starting when the user first does shift-enter. Another option is that we could have an explicit button like start kernel now, and then with the idea that we want to give users the chance to select from a drop-down menu.
Yeah, and theoretically, so delayed kernel start would mean we'd have to make the UI make sense without a kernel, which is something that if you've ever had your kernels die all the way, you realize isn't the case.
Well, and part of we currently have I don't know where this bug came from. So it used to be that when kernels died, that the front end was aware of this and would restart them.
That was when you added the kernel restarter, the back end, the server restarts the kernel, not the front end. So as far as the front end is concerned, it's purely a notification. There's no action for the front end to take.
But there are times and we'll have to track this down, there are times where it doesn't happen.
Where what doesn't happen?
Kernels are not restarted.
That would mean that it failed to restart at least 5 times.
Yeah.
Which I do when, like, if I'm working on PyZMQ and I make it not importable, then kernel start will fail 5 times and then it will go into an all dead.
Yeah, what?
And you get the five overlaid dialogue.
Yes, so that you get the nice fade to black of the 20% overlay or whatever it is.
Hold on. I'm going to have to search. I think there's actually an issue about this.
Okay.
But I think in general, I think it would. I think we do want to move in a direction that allows for the UI to function well without a kernel running.
Yeah.
You could imagine that, for example, maybe we don't offer live code running on NBViewer, but if we add GitHub based auth, that you can at least edit your notebooks on NBViewer. And so there's other contexts that we've thought about where pure editing may be very nice. Even in the context of Google Docs, where the execution model for multiple users is perhaps confusing when the kernel is running under a portable native client, you can imagine that someone would say, oh, I don't care about the confusing execution model. I just want to write this notebook and work on the content. And so I think, in general, it's a good move for us to allow to decouple notebook opening from kernel starting.
But do you want to decouple from session? Because then in session you have on kernel spec you have the information about the syntax highlighting and the logo and everything. You still need to have a kernel which is associated. So it might not just be a delayed start on the back end.
No, absolutely. I mean,
but that's in the notebook document metadata.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah,
That's
the kernel specs are fully queryable without launching a kernel.
Yeah, you don't need a kernel to know about what kernel you will use.
Yes, and that should, for example, that information should determine the state of the kernel drop-down menu, right? If you open up a notebook that was last run with a Python kernel, it should show up as a Python kernel selected when you open that notebook.
What's perhaps slightly more problematic is that without a kernel, then you only get the very basic JavaScript tab completions. Because our serious completions are implemented as a request to the kernel.
Yeah, we do like IntelliSense stuff of static analysis completion.
Yeah, but I mean that maybe that's another place where we would auto start the kernel, like that. I mean, there could be a set of different events that we watch for that will trigger kernel starting, and maybe tab completion is one of them. I mean,
basically, when you try to use the kernel, if it isn't there, start it.
Yeah, exactly, and that, in my mind, having that logic expressed in exactly that way is sort of insurance against our other abstraction about kernel restarting being broken, right? I mean, you're right in the sense that ideally...
If you have reasonable UI for starting a kernel, you should have reasonable UI for recovering from a dead kernel.
Yeah.
Because a dead kernel should just enter the I don't have a kernel state.
Exactly.
Which currently doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's my...
Now, I'll tell you something though, because if you keep trying to run a cell and it starts a kernel and the kernel dies and it goes back to not having a kernel.
Well, right, if the kernel's dying, right, every time you run a cell, you're going to get 5 notification dialogues, as it is right now.
Now, obviously, when a kernel is part of this logic at startup should be to detect if there's already a kernel running for that notebook. Sure. Now, are you guys ready to have a lot of fun? So, static widgets. Right now, so John has been working on it's not really a static widget. It's widgets persisting through page reloads.
Mhm.
And John, how does this change your approach to that? And I'm recalling a discussion you and I had maybe 2 weeks ago about this. Also talking some about the security issues involved.
I think we're echoing through. Yeah.
Who's echoing?
Brian's echoing.
Wait, are you echoing through me? I was muted, I think. Or am I still echoing? Hold on. Let me.
So we haven't talked about yet, but John and I realized that to render widgets on the page upon page reload is a new security risk. I mean, you're basically...
Well, widgets are untrusted output, right? So widgets should only load on the page if HTML output would also be loaded on the page.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought we did bring that up, didn't we? The meeting, the dev meeting.
So there's already
sign all the widgets.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we talked about it at lunch or something. Yeah. It's widgets. Persisted widgets are just yet another untrusted output, or sorry, not untrusted, unsafe output.
Okay.
So it should be treated like all the other things when in the trust question.
Okay.
So they go into the signature.
So, but in terms of the re-rendering the widgets as it relates to kernel management.
Oh yeah.
So this may mean when you right, the notebook is loaded.
Mm-hmm.
If there's not a kernel running, the notebook loading will say, I didn't find a kernel, and so I'm going to open the notebook in the state where there's no kernel running, but the user can still edit. Then you try to go, the next step would be you try to redraw the widgets, and you would not have a kernel running at that point.
But that's, so even at the moment, if you start a kernel when the notebook loads, it doesn't have the necessary things set up to talk to the widgets. So you're going to have to put, if there isn't a kernel set up to talk to the widgets, then you have to put them into the disabled state.
Yeah, which is what I do right now.
Okay, so you think
because restarting a kernel will break all your widgets too.
Yep.
So it's
and right now what I do is I just force clear all of them and then recreate them, and then create them in a disabled state, and they wait to enable themselves until the kernel is completely restarted.
Okay.
Yeah, so it seems like it should handle this, since it already needs to handle kind of a similar I don't work yet or I don't work at all start. It seems like that it shouldn't need to change much.
Okay.
If there's not a kernel at all.
Great.
There's one thing that is going to be a bit trickier, I think, because unfortunately the front end is written in the horrible language it is that a lot of things would be simpler if we had stuff like properties. Because if you want to ask a question like, as soon as I use a kernel, make sure it's started, there are things that there are language features that make that kind of thing really nice. They're called, in Python, they're called properties.
Yeah, exactly.
And in languages like JavaScript, the only way you could... I'm getting some GSM buzz. The only way you can get that is turning the kernel attribute, getting rid of the kernel attribute and using
an API.
Explicit getters and setters everywhere, which is horrible.
We're going to have to budget some money to send you to therapy, man.
You especially need to have getters and setters. I mean, you can look at whether or not you pass
No, you don't
arguments
need
to the
setters. You
function
need
or not.
getters, though. Yeah, but we need to turn every call from, this.kernel needs to be this.getKernel. And just get rid of the this.kernel attribute because it's unsafe.
Yeah, I know. So really, there's absolutely no way in JavaScript to do.
It's just not. Yeah, you can't override get attribute basically.
Yeah, that's always been my impression.
Yeah, and I think most languages don't have side effecty get attribute.
Yeah.
I imagine a lot of people more comfortable with other languages think it's icky that foo.bar can just getting bar out of foo can create all kinds of stuff, but it's useful because it lets you it lets you transition from plain attributes to getter and or setter logic without changing the API, which is I think a nice thing, but
yeah,
it's a bit magical.
The way other languages get around that is that they just recommend that everybody write getters and setters even when you don't actually need them.
Yeah,
that's the Java and C++ way.
Yeah.
No, part of what I'm really curious to see is how other languages implement the back-end part of the widgets where traits are involved.
Yeah, I think Julia is starting to look at it.
Yeah. I mean, does Julia have something like descriptor protocols or properties or?
I don't know.
No. Yeah, I don't. But, okay. So I think that, yeah, so let's see. In terms of ordering, I guess all the front-end UI work will have to wait till the require.js stuff is done.
Okay.
And John, do you have any update on that for us? Or well, I guess let's follow.
Yeah, I do. It's on the Hackback.
Yeah, let's just follow the agenda. Sorry.
SciPy tutorials. Then.
Oh yeah, yeah. The SciPy tutorial dependency thing is due tomorrow. In case anybody wasn't keeping track of that.
Is there anything in particular we need to do?
No, I don't. Did you guys get an email from organizers? I did. Okay.
I deleted it.
Nice.
It's due tomorrow. I don't think you need much. They just gave an example from Jake of like here's a script you can run to make sure you have all the dependencies.
My assumption was that every single tutorial is going to require the things that we will require, so we don't need to say anything.
But some people might only come to your tutorial. That might be the first tutorial.
Yeah, that's very true.
But yeah, so just a simple script that's just like, import widgets, make sure that IPython is 2.x, that kind of thing.
I have a feeling, Brian, that your tutorial might be one of the first.
It is, yeah.
But yeah, I don't think it needs more than 5 or 10 minutes of your time, but I think they want a response from tutorial people, and I thought maybe people would not be aware that it's due tomorrow.
I definitely wasn't. Thank you.
Okay. Then, yeah, the next thing, which I especially wanted to get Kyle's input on,
yeah,
which I don't know if we wanted, since it's kind of a long topic, maybe we should kind of take this out of the meeting today, but there's some challenges in the multi-user design in terms of using cookies for authentication when the multi-user server and the single-user servers are behind one proxy, which is kind of the basic design goal of the multi-user thing. But it means that the cookie you use to log into your server would be sent to anything behind this proxy, which means that if I log in and start working as me, if I visit your single-user server, even if I don't get authenticated, your single-user server got my cookie.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's a question of how much do we want to protect against that?
So like as I was thinking about it over the weekend, I guess the scary part is that we're kind of tying ourselves to a single user model that we already have.
Yep.
In reality, like there should probably be like a centralized server for auth.
There is.
Right. Okay. So you get the cookie at the multi-server level, and then that's what you end up passing on to
The problem is that the single user server it's also behind the same proxy. So when the browser hits it, it gets all the same cookies that you sent to the multi-user server because they're not going to be on different domains.
Is there a way for the single user server to actually not run as that user, but that the kernels only run in the context of that user?
That is an option. It's substantially more complex than
it
is.
Than what
Why not encrypt the part of the cookie that interests us with a key on each server, so that when you basically your cookie is read by another server, it's useless?
No, but so if they have the cookie, that was sent to you. It doesn't matter how you encrypt it, because they have the cookie in the form that it is in the browser.
Yeah, you have the same replay attack.
Yeah.
No,
You just now have it with an encrypted. Yeah.
Yeah, and so far without changing the process model, which is an option, of course, without changing the process model, the only thing that I have come up with is actually using a different cookie for each single user server and filtering cookies at the proxy level, so that the cookie just doesn't arrive at the other.
So basically, those cookies would never get to each other's backend servers.
Yeah, and the reason to not do that is that that's logic in the proxy, and the proxy is in Node.js, and all the logic that's in JavaScript is bad. Every line of code that's in JavaScript is a bad line of code.
Yes, when Min's writing JavaScript, the min cursors per minute metric definitely increases.
Yeah. The nice thing is I have a very simple configurable proxy working. I don't think John found it and fixed something in the README.
Yeah.
I don't think I told anybody that this repo existed, but
John's following
I was stalking you, sorry.
but yeah, I have a very, very basic thing, and it works fine. It sets the multi-user server, sets the cookie, configures the proxy, and then it forwards to the single user server, which does auth, but then asks the auth server whether the cookie is the right one, and so it's fairly simple and it works. But the more logic that exists in the proxy, the worse.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, yeah. So I think it comes down to a question of what do we mean by these users are semi-trusted? Like, are they trusted enough that we are confident that they will never attack each other, never steal each other's content, etc.? Or do we simply trust them at a global or organizational level that they're not going to be? I don't know. I think it is a question of what the usage case for this is and the level of trust that we.
Yeah, because the attack vector is you have to get someone else who is authenticated to visit your notebook server.
Right.
And whether it's you or whether it's someone who has compromised your system. And what they have to have done is either compromise your notebook server so that it's not actually the IPython notebook server, right? Because the IPython notebook server, you can't get the cookies that have been requested out. Like, it doesn't print cookies to the terminal or anything.
Right.
So either you have to replace the server with something else, or you have to Just you could inspect, you can inspect the memory of any process that's yours, right?
Yes.
So if someone visits, that cookie's going to be in memory somewhere. You can sniff it out with, elite hacking skills.
In terms of, or if you can get malicious JavaScript onto the notebook page, then
yes.
you can
then JavaScript can get the cookies.
In terms of replacing the notebook, I think it's straightforward to, when we start the single user servers, hard code the path that it's launching from to something that's not user writable.
Yeah, although they could probably have files. I think it might be difficult to prevent import IPython from returning something else.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, there's a flag that you can pass over, and it cuts out all site packages.
Yeah, you want user custom. So I think, yeah. So I'm trying to figure out if this is something that we need to resolve before we move forward with the whole thing, or if this is something that we can know is a problem and figure it out as we go.
I guess we're not gonna like attack against it until we have it running with what we have. So maybe just go with it for now.
Okay, just kind of figure it out later.
Yeah, I know that's like terrible. I'm just like, I don't have any other I don't have any other good options right now, and I think what you have is decent. I hate
the other option is just a fundamentally different design where instead of spawning single user servers, we have one. So right now, the multi-user design is a proxy, an auth server, and subprocess manager, and then single user servers that basically just have URL prefixes. And in some ways, that's the easiest way to isolate users from each other, because once the server is there's only so much you can do. And the multi-user server doesn't do anything. It doesn't write files. It doesn't do anything other than the privileged server doesn't do anything other than spawn your notebook server. And so once you're doing notebook stuff, you can't do anything that the Unix user couldn't do, because the processes are you. But a totally different model would be to have the multi-user server actually be a multi-user version of the notebook server, and then the only thing you're spawning is kernels. And then all this, because there isn't a server running as a user, you don't have the issues with.
Yeah, so I guess that means that we also still have kind of permission models on the notebooks themselves, since you can still delete them and create them from the panel, like if we're going with that model.
Yeah, if you're going with that model, we would need to add a bunch of. It would mean it's substantially more complex, because we would have to re-implement a lot of. Right, Notebook Manager would need to know about users. Right, that's the main thing. Is Notebook Manager would need to say, write this file as me, read this file as me, and all that stuff, rather than just letting the process. And we could do something in between where we actually spawn notebook managers and subprocesses and just talk to notebook managers via an extra hop.
What happens if you with the proxy? No, because you can only have one thing listening on a port. I was thinking, like, what would happen if the user started a web server in their kernel, but it wouldn't get proxied because that would have to be on a different port from the notebook server.
Right. Yeah, if they start another web server, it would be on a different.
Couldn't we require a subdomain when we have a multi-user server so that we can have no?
No.
We did think about that, but the kind of the target market that we're aiming at with campuses and things, we suspect it's not practical to get like, DNS servers configured and things to run this. You can probably get a domain to.
Yeah, I have a couple of domains. I mean, I guess one thing we could do is have that be, although that would actually break the current auth model because we depend on the cookie being set by the multi-user server being received by the single user server.
You could redirect to a URL with a one-time password embedded that would set a cookie.
Yeah. Okay, so that's solvable. Yeah, so we could say that we have this vulnerability if you don't have domains, but then have a mechanism that says, if you want to protect users for each other, you can set up 2 domains, and so that
Do you need 2 domains?
No, you need n domains. You need n plus 1 domains. Yeah, that's rough. N plus 1 domains is real rough.
Can you guys hear me again?
Yeah.
I don't
know. Well, I'll keep thinking about it. I just thought maybe someone had an insight that I didn't.
So I think when we're at SciPy, we should hit a whiteboard.
Yeah.
And hash this out some more.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be there through the tutorials too. So.
Yeah, that. Nice.
Okay. Talk about 3.0. So 3.0, we've got static widgets, outstanding PR, NB format 4, not at all written. Multi-user server, I have a toy that doesn't actually start notebooks. So are we going to release by SciPy?
So next week.
Yeah.
I don't think the multi-user, because the multi-user server will be a separate project, I don't think that should be related to the 3.0 release.
But it will need some changes.
Yeah, the main changes it will need are pluggable auth for the single user server. And there is an open PR that starts that. But yeah, you won't be able, if we don't hold it, you won't be able to use the multi-user server with IPython 3. It's going to need some modification, mainly to auth.
Modification shouldn't be too drastic.
No, it should really just be pluggable auth. Should be like the whole thing.
Does there need to be some configurability because it has to run the server at a different URL from where the...
We already have that. That's the base URL configurable. Okay. Yeah, so we already have what we need to run behind a proxy.
Well, there's one other place, and that is we may... I'm trying to think if we're going to need to change some of the UI for example, like what URLs the log out and login button hits in the single user.
Yeah, that would need to actually, that would need a different base URL from the rest of that. But I think that's it.
So there's that. And then also, I think we need to have somewhere the ability for the user to click something on the page to get back to the top level multi-user server. But
yeah, once there's content there. What I have right now is it's nothing but login.
Yeah.
It's login and redirect. So it seems entirely possible to me that the initial like 0.1 multi-user server
doesn't do that.
Will actually have nothing but a login page on the multi-user server.
Okay.
Yeah. Ultimately, we'll obviously really add stuff, but
I think
we said that 3.0, the multi-user server is just the very basic.
Yeah, starting processes, starting notebook servers and proxying and whatnot.
Yeah, there seems to be a way to have cookie on subpath.
Cookie on subpath?
Yes. Yeah. I got that in a. I have issues with the internet connection, so I cannot have it in cache.
Yeah, I don't have an internet connection.
Okay, yeah, I'll look at cookie. If you set the cookie to the path, it will be available to all pages. Oh, never mind. Okay, yeah, I'll look at cookie paths. That might be the whole thing.
So for the static
So,
widget stuff, do we want to include the full static widget stuff or just the persistent widgets for 3.0?
Well, I mean, it sort of depends on when we want to target releasing.
If static widgets was the only thing holding it up, I probably wouldn't block on it. But if it seems like there are a few other things that we're going to be waiting for, so if you think it's practical to get static widgets in that time frame, then go for it.
Okay.
Now, in what time frame? Sci-fi?
In the yeah. I mean, with what we have, because right now what we have in, assuming we punt on almost everything, what we have in that.
let's just release today,
We're ready. We're ready. The test passed. The tree is green. We're good to go.
Yeah. So right now we have the kernel spec stuff mostly done, and that's really the only new feature we have, or in the message spec. Those are the only new things we have in master.
Bootstrap 3.
What?
Bootstrap 3.
Oh yeah, and some UI stuff. So that, to me, that's nowhere near compelling for a major release.
You can start the Qt console with --kernel IR.
Yeah, I mean, there's cool stuff, but I think.
Yes, we're not at the stage of getting ready to release some things.
Yeah, I don't think there's enough in. Like, I think we need at least a couple of these major milestones for it to be worth doing a major release. And I think most of them are at least multi-month projects. So
I mean,
go ahead.
The other thing is that we're scheduling sort of the next dev meeting around September, right? Like having a major release and then not being able to figure out what our next steps are going to be soon after that also doesn't make sense, right? Either we need to have a release like sort of like this week or next week so that we can talk at Sci-Fi for future work, or we need to punt and have a release sort of a few weeks before our next dev meeting, I think.
Well, and we've released shortly after both of our last dev meetings.
Sure, yeah, okay, but sort of around that time frame.
Yeah, so let's aim, and in both cases we aimed for shortly before the dev meeting.
Right.
So okay, so let's, as strict as we are about release dates.
Yes.
Should we just aim for September 1st?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. So let's vaguely aim for as early in fall as we can, which may or may not be spring.
From a user standpoint, from people that I've talked to since 2.0 release, like with all the widgets and stuff, people are so stoked on that I think that we got enough to tie them down and keep them happy until September.
Yeah, we don't need, we vaguely said, this 6-month release plan, but that was really just a kind of a guideline of, hey, let's see if this works, and I think we move a bit slower than that.
Well, and actually 6 months from April will be October, right?
That's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah, when we miss one 6-month deadline, we don't have to try and back up in the next release.
So that's, my thinking has actually been that we basically drop the summer release, and that we do 3.0 when we were planning on doing 4.0 in the winter. I think even if we aim for early fall, that's probably what will happen. but as we experienced with releasing in April, we were still aiming for January in March. And so just because I don't think we will release before winter doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Yes, if we try to release for winter, then we'll probably release
summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think aiming for autumn is a good plan.
Okay. Just as long as we're not still pretending we're going to get it out in July.
We're not, yeah.
What, you mean
Unless it's July 2015.
The server done time.
Yeah. All right. Required JS.
John. I muted you because you were typing a lot. So.
Sorry about that. I'm like, wait, why can't I talk? So yeah, I got the required JS stuff working with air quotes. There's a couple bugs still. Like I think there's the keyboard manager doesn't get propagated correctly in some places, so exceptions don't get registered. So like when you're trying to rename a notebook, you can't really rename a notebook with D or S or any of those keys.
My favorite part of the JavaScript code base.
Some small things like that, but I mean, I would say it's working. Like everything shows up on the page. You can run code. You can see output. Like, I mean, most of it is the hard stuff is done. So I made a cool little dynamic graph, and I didn't host it anywhere too nice. I put the link there, so it's just at my GitHub IO page. If you open it, you can play with the graph of all the dependencies, and you can hover over individual ones, and it highlights like which files those files load in. And I also posted a static image there that I kind of hand arranged. If you drag the points in the dynamic graph, you can lock them into position. So yeah, I just posted that so we could kind of talk about how we want this to be structured. This pretty much is what's required to get everything to work. We have one circular dependency, which I thought was kind of strange. What is it? It's like the toolbar and the text cell or something like that. It is Notebook.js text cell and Notebook.js cell toolbar. There's a circular dependency there. And I don't remember why. I saw that in the graph and I didn't look at it in the code. So I don't remember why there's that circular dependency.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, that's not something that we probably want to discuss here. But I just thought I'd throw that out. And then
okay, so getting a little closer.
Yeah, a lot closer, I would say. I'm going to go over all of it and make a major change that Matthias suggested, which is removing the IPython namespace from all the lower level modules and populating it in the top level, in the main JS of the tree and of the.
So that means you're not going to access it anywhere?
Yes. Yes. So so right now in that graph that you have that I've rendered, I manually excluded it from it. But if you saw the graph with the IPython namespace reference, literally every single file loads into that.
Yeah. So here's a question. If you're populating it in main.js, so people have code in custom.js that's like IPython.codecell.cm config, customize code mirror config.
Yeah.
IPython.codecell will be undefined when custom.js is loaded. In fact, it will be undefined for an indefinite period of time after that.
Yeah. So I guess that's a good point. Do we want to change how?
No, because we ask the user to wait for notebook loaded event before triggering the change, right?
Oh, that's right.
Actually, for this code mirror config, you actually want it needs to happen before the notebook is loaded. Otherwise, it won't affect any of the cells on the page. it'll only affect new cells.
But I mean, even Julia and other kernels have custom loops that go through all cells and reset things because
Yeah, but
it
that's
doesn't work.
awful. Right? That's really bad.
So I mean, what I was thinking of doing isn't much different than what is being done now with the require stuff. I would just move the code that populates the IPython namespace out.
Yeah, but that's
main.
significant because it affects it dramatically changes the state when custom.js is loaded. So it effectively
In the context,
means that it effectively means that as far as custom.js is concerned, that namespace doesn't exist.
Oh, okay.
Well,
because
no,
custom
I guess if you do it
custom.
because you could, the other way to do it is to do this, if you're modifying code cell, is you require code cell and then modify code cell that way, which is probably the better way to do it, right? Matthias?
Yeah.
Is it in
but,
custom.js you would require code cell?
But we just add the shim with the IPython top-level module for backward compatibility, so it might not work in every case. Then people have to migrate to require.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering how useful is it to add it for backward compatibility if it doesn't actually work?
Oh, it's super useful when you're doing things in the prompt, in the JavaScript console, because you can basically inspect everything without having to require and remember the name of everything.
Yeah, that's going to be an issue for somebody to use custom.js, for them to know the layout of our code and where things are and what to require.
I mean, it's part of the documentation and the discussion with Brian, or where the docstring are and are they separated with star at the beginning.
Yeah.
And you know that nobody agrees, and we don't ship documentation from JavaScript.
Yeah, that's an issue. Yeah, and it may be that we should start, right? Because you could require. You don't need to require everything. You could require main, for example. Right.
And that would get you everything? Is that what you mean then?
Because main requires everything. So you could just say,
okay, yeah,
just give me IPython.
Give me all of it. Give me all the things.
Yeah, and that would be kind of the shortcut.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, but in the end, we want to get rid of the main IPython namespace, right? Or not?
I
kind of don't think so. Right? Because let's say we have all these classes and they happen to be one per file. It shouldn't have any effect if we decided, you know what, let's actually take all of those classes and concatenate them into a single JavaScript file. That should still be fine, right? The number of files affects how you use require. It should not affect the JavaScript API that you actually use once things are on the page.
One question for John, because you use require. You can configure require to have like some prefix on everything. Like, I don't know, like you can have the file that have their own tree dependency, but add a shim that say, hey, actually cell.js should be required by app/cell or something like that. You see what I mean?
No, I don't see what you mean. Are you talking about the base URL?
No. In require you can make aliases, I think, for.
Oh yeah. I do that with jQuery.
Yeah, we do it for jQuery, Backbone,
underscore and
extensions. Yeah.
So basically, that's what should be static. The aliases should be static, and where we keep our file is up to us.
Yeah, but even the number of files is something that shouldn't, like, if we concatenate all of those, right? It shouldn't be significant that text cell is in a different file from code cell.
Okay.
Yeah.
That you should just, it doesn't matter, we could reorganize all of those, and then you just get ipython.codecell.
Yeah, you can
is loaded. So I think actually we shouldn't remove the module namespace. I think it's more sensible than relying, because if we rely on require of individual files, you're making our file layout a public API, right?
True.
And
Very
if
true.
you had-
Unless
if you had
we use
if you had
path aliases for everything.
Yeah, and as Matthias said, if you had aliases, it's not exactly our file layout, but it is our number of files.
True. True. And then that restricts us from using like RJS, the compile a single JS file.
Yeah. So I don't.
I mean, it's not bad. Like I would be happy not going through and removing the IPython namespace from all the files, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, because then it prevents someone, if you have the IPython namespace, it prevents someone from reusing our file, or even us to rewrite a front end that use some of our file.
I'm not sure how that's true.
What do you mean? Can you explain more?
Well, then,
How does it
if
prevent?
you want to use text cell without the IPython main directory, you cannot just reuse that. You have to pass an empty namespace, and it will be appended to it.
Oh,
But it depends on.
but it requires the namespace, so it should load it in if you.
Yeah, so it's better to pass nothing and get it returned and plug it where we use it than to force people to require something that just populate an empty namespace.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I mean, we don't use the IPython.textcell anywhere. We always internally will use require. The only reason it exists is just for convenience. So I don't see why they would have to populate it unless they expect to be able to use IPython.textcell from the console.
Yeah, but because to load the IPython text cell, to use text cell, you have to create you basically have to pass it IPython.
You don't have to pass it. It gets IPython from its own require dependency, right?
Yes, you just
So you
require
don't have to do anything.
Yeah, but then if you require text cell, it pull out main, and main pull out the rest.
Text cell doesn't pull in main.
No, it
Main
doesn't.
pulls in text cell.
Main pulls in notebook, which pulls in textcell.
Yeah. So if you just have text cell, you don't have notebook and you don't have main. But you do have the IPython namespace, the base IPython namespace, because that is required by text cell. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So text cell
this
requires.
is going back to what Jonathan was saying earlier, in that you could, instead of every single file requiring the base namespace, you could have, something that requires all of those files and puts them into a combined namespace.
Which is what Matthias had told me on the PR. That's what I was asking about. Should we do that? Should we populate it at a higher level and just not require the namespace everywhere? I don't think it will make a difference except for load order. If custom.js is loaded like in the construction of the notebook or like somewhere around there, it won't be available until the notebook is done being constructed and main reaches the end of its execution. Because it would be populated at the end of main.js. Is when the IPython namespace would be populated. And I was just wondering if that's okay. It's okay that it gets populated at the end of the execution.
Yeah, I still don't see a benefit to making that change. It doesn't seem to simplify anything.
It would be hard. It would be hard to do because then we would have to have all this knowledge of how we want to fill it out, because if we do it that way, each namespace that gets loaded in will have to keep handles to the child namespaces, right? And then we'll have a tree of names, and we'll basically be flattening that tree manually in main.js into our IPython namespace.
This is the way that module systems in general work, isn't it? I mean, you load the things that you're going to use and then use them.
Yeah. So
you import in Python.
Well, so what I'm saying is to fill in the IPython namespace the way that we're doing now, we will have to do IPython.textcell equals IPython or equals notebook.textcell, and then so on and so forth for even further nested things. Does that make sense? So the namespace will depend on the dependency graph, the structure of the namespace, and then this IPython namespace that we create, we'll have to flatten that ourselves.
Yeah, I guess I'm partly inclined to kind of do one thing at a time.
Yeah.
So then, how about we just do this as
by
is?
that, yeah, sorry, that was extremely vague. By that I mean get things loaded with require with as little change as possible, and then maybe do the reconsidering how we treat the namespace in another PR.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because we definitely want to use require to load everything, and we may want to get rid of the namespace altogether, or move it to main or something. And they're related, but they're not really the same task.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe
Well,
try to just get it loaded without changing how it populates the namespace, except in ways that you have to get require to work. And then maybe change how we deal with the namespace in another PR.
That sounds good, because that's how I have it right now. So it works. It populates the namespace in the same structure.
Does that sound okay, Matthias?
Yep.
Because then it will be easier to see the difference between require but changing the namespace. Because right now it's hard to see because it's hard to see how much of the changes are needed for require to just work, and how much of the changes are kind of
improvements with air quotes.
Yeah.
Improvements with air quotes.
Yeah.
Air quotes.
Air quotes. Yeah. Okay.
Error quotes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, maybe let's do that.
And
One more question, though. I have one more question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
You just asked it. Is that okay? Yes, it is.
Yeah.
That's it. You're done.
So I was talking to Thomas earlier about this. The way that I'm using require right now is if a module is defining just one class within it, I just return that class directly.
Mm-hmm.
So later when you go to import that module, you're not actually importing the module, you're importing the class directly, and that leads to that confusion that I think Paul had where some things were capitalized, some things were lowercase. So I was wondering if it would make more sense to just always return a dictionary so it behaves exactly like the IPython import. So if for example in text,
Sorry, can you give 2 examples?
yeah, I can give a couple
Or just one of
examples.
each?
So so looking at Notebook.js, Notebook.js requires TextCell.js, right? TextCell.js returns TextCell, the class. So then inside Notebook.js, where it imports the TextCell.js, it imports it directly into TextCell, the name, with capital T, because it's the class at that point.
So essentially, it's a sort of an import turned into you import a module and it just sort of magically turns into the class that module defines.
Yeah. It's like
It's more like a from import and then the class name. It's more like that.
Except that you don't need to specify the class name because
Yeah, exactly.
You can do the change in another PR also. Like, just get everything working, and we can revisit having modules in the later PR.
Yeah, because with the way it works now, you don't actually need to keep the handle on TextCell, right? Because it's available as IPython.textcell also.
Yeah.
So you do require base namespace. So yeah, I don't know what makes the most sense.
I think it makes more sense to always return a dictionary. So there,
I
a
agree.
little more verbose, it would be a dict, and then it would be the name of the class colon TextCell. So it would be
So
TextCell
treat
colon
it like a
TextCell.
module.
Yeah, and then so when you
module, the
import it,
namespace.
yeah, exactly. When you import it, it's a lowercase import, and you do textcell.textcell with a capital T.
I think that makes sense.
But in a different PR? Or in this PR?
If it's straightforward to do it, then I would do it in
because
PR, since
you're just going to need to change the return cell tool. What if you... So if it's a dictionary with one key, the dictionary where cell toolbar is defined is called IPython. So if you just returned IPython, which is in fact what it used to do.
Oh, yeah, I could do that.
I think,
but
I mean, that would be weird. That would be weird.
Yeah,
but that would also
probably explicit is better than implicit.
Yeah. So changing the return cell toolbar to return a one-line literal cell toolbar : cell toolbar, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's all
so I would go ahead and do that.
Okay, I'll do that everywhere then. Because if I returned IPython, that would be kind of scary. Because then every it would be weird. Because every import would be importing the same.
Yeah, everything you would require would return IPython, and the things that are modules, which I guess there's only one. It's utils. Is that the only one? No, I think there are a few.
Yeah, util's a module, security's a module, there's a couple modules.
Okay.
And the widgets are all modules. I did all the widgets as modules.
Okay, yeah, so let's just be consistent. And so for the things that are just a class, make them an object with one attribute, or an object with one, whatever the fuck they call it.
And just so that people are aware, once this is in place, we're going to rework how widget instantiation works. At the moment, like when you create a widget from the Python side, it has a view name, and similarly comms have a target name, and that has to be pre-registered in a dictionary on the JavaScript side so that it knows what class that name represents. When we've got the required JS and stuff in place, we're going to cut out those registries and have it so it has like a view name and view module, and it will require this module and get its name from it and instantiate that. That was how we ran into this question of should everything be a module.
Okay. So last thing is danger zone.
Danger zone. I just decided to make a room because like Matthias was starting to ask me about my job search. And I'm like, I don't want to trash the dev room with chatter about that, and so I made a new room, danger zone, and you can put things like baby goats in there and other distracting things, so that now there's a place for me in the IPython.
I didn't actually have a problem with that sort of stuff going into the the dev room.
No, but see, the problem, you don't have a problem with it, but you don't know how many times I've filtered myself from putting something into the dev room.
Okay,
you don't know how much stuff isn't in how much orphaned.
How many more pugs need to lick your screen?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's it for today. Great. Anything else?
Yeah. No, that's it. That's a wrap.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, internets.